One man, one sword, 40 million deaths. About 800 years ago, a warrior was born on this earth whose very name made emperors tremble. Kingdoms crumbled beneath the hooves of his horses. In just 25 years, he built an empire that was the largest in all of history. From China to Europe, from Siberia to the doorstep of India, his name was Genghis Khan. But did you know? This great conqueror actually began as an orphaned, exiled child. His own clan abandoned his family and the child who hunted rats just to eat would one day become the most powerful man on earth. So how did a destitute child become a warrior who shook the world? How did he build an army that no force on earth could stand against? And the biggest question of all, was he truly a merciless killer or a visionary ruler? Today, we'll learn the complete story of Genghis Khan, from birth to death, his battle strategies, his governance, and the legacy he left behind. We'll uncover the secrets of his life that you may have never heard before. So let's begin this incredible journey. And yes, if you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe, because History Decode Bangla brings you more exciting history stories. The year is 1162. On the vast grasslands of Mongolia, cold winds blow and clouds gather. In a small tent in this harsh environment, a child is born. It is said that child was born clutching a clot of blood in his fist. According to Mongol belief, this was an auspicious sign. This child would one day be a great warrior and conqueror. His father, Yasuke, was a minor chief of the Borte clan, a brave warrior, but not a very powerful leader. His mother was Holan, a courageous and remarkably intelligent woman. The child was named Temujin, meaning iron or steel, a name that would prove his strength. But did you know? Temujin's father had actually kidnapped his mother. Yes, you heard that right. In that era, among the Mongols, this happened often. Holan was on her way to marry another man when Yasuke seized her. This was a kind of warrior behavior considered normal at the time. But Temujin's childhood was far from happy. At just 9 years old, disaster fell upon his life, a disaster that would completely change everything. One day, Yasuke went to visit the Tatar clan, their ancient enemies. Centuries of hostility existed between the two tribes. The Tatars recognized Yasuke and did something terrible. They poisoned his food. A few days later, writhing in agony, Yasuke died. And that is when Temujin's real nightmare began, one beyond imagining. The clan members who had followed Yasuke's leadership now refused to take responsibility for a widowed mother and her small children. They thought, why should we share our food and resources for this weak family? One day, quietly, they packed everything up and left. Tents, food, livestock, horses, all of it. They left only Holan and her 6 children, completely empty-handed, in the middle of the wilderness. Imagine it. A 9-year-old child, father just died. The entire clan, everyone he knew and trusted, gone. Winter approaching. No food, no shelter. Danger on all sides. But Holan did not give up. This extraordinary woman, whose courage and intelligence were beyond belief, began the fight to keep her children alive. It was a battle of life and death. They ate wild onions, wild garlic, berries, whatever plants they could find. They caught small fish from rivers. They hunted mice, rabbits, squirrels, whatever they could get. Temujin and his brothers learned how to shoot a bow and arrow, how to set traps, how to survive in brutal winters and brutal conditions. These experiences hardened them, but also made them ruthless. Poverty and deprivation bring out the worst in people. Hunger and desperation drive men mad. One day, a fight broke out over food. Temujin's half-brother Bektar repeatedly refused to share food fairly. He was older, he was stronger, so he took more. He was constantly unjust. He bullied the younger one. And one day, when it could no longer be tolerated, Temujin and his brother Khazar made a decision. This cannot go on. They took their bows and killed Bektar. A boy barely 10 or 11 years old killed his own half-brother. Horrifying, isn't it? But this was the reality of Mongolia at that time. To survive, you had to be hard. There was no room for weakness. Holun exploded with rage. She told Temujin, "You are a monster. You killed your own brother." But deep down, Temujin had understood. In this world, to survive, you must show strength. Weakness is not an option. But his problems only grew. The Taichuid clan, once allies, began to fear him. Temujin was growing up, getting stronger, becoming bolder. Perhaps one day he would return for revenge, to seize power. So they decided, Temujin must be captured now, finished while he is still. One night, they raided Temujin's small camp. Temujin tried to flee. He hid in the forest, but they caught him. They locked a heavy wooden kang around his neck, a punishment device that pinned his hands and head. It was so heavy he could barely move, barely eat, barely sleep. But Temujin was clever and patient. He waited. He planned. And one day, when his captors were celebrating and everyone had gotten drunk, he smashed the heavy kang down on a guard's head and knocked him unconscious. He escaped. He hid in a river, submerged, with only his face above the water to breathe, while his enemies searched everywhere and found none. And at that desperate moment, a savior appeared. A man named Sorkan-Shira, an ordinary man from the very Taichuid clan. He found Temujin hiding in the river and said nothing. Instead, he told him, "Run. I won't tell anyone." He hid Temujin in his home, fed him, and helped him escape. This event taught Temujin a vital lesson. The value of loyalty and faithfulness is infinite. Those who stand by you in times of danger must never be forgotten. And true to that lesson, many years later, when Temujin had become Genghis Khan, the most powerful man on earth, he searched for Sorkan-Shira and his family and rewarded them with great honor, land, and wealth. Genghis Khan never forgot who had helped. But Temujin's story was not only one of suffering. His life also held friendship, love, and dreams. When his father was still alive, he had taken young Temujin to meet a girl named Borte, beautiful, intelligent, and brave, from the Ongaric clan. From that very first meeting, Temujin knew this is the girl he would marry. A few years later, at around age 16, he returned to propose. Her family accepted him, even though he was a penniless young man with no power and no wealth. Borte's father gave him a gift, a precious black sable fur coat, an extremely valuable item, and that coat changed Temujin's fate entirely. Temujin was clever. He understood this coat could help him forge a powerful alliance. He decided to gift it to Togrul, Khan of the Karaite tribe, and his father's old friend. Togrul, also called Ong Khan, was one of Mongolia's most powerful leaders. Thousands of warriors under his command, vast territory under his control. Yasuke had once helped him in a war, and Togrul had not forgotten that debt. When Temujin arrived humbly with the precious coat and asked for help, Togrul was pleased. He embraced Temujin and promised, "Your father was my dearest friend. Now you are like a son to me. I will help you. I will protect you." This was Temujin's first great political move, and it proved he was not just a warrior, but a diplomat and a strategist. He understood that nothing is possible without powerful allies. But there was another crucial person in his life, Jamukha. Jamukha was Temujin's childhood friend. They had played together, hunted together, dreamed together. They were the closest of friends. When Temujin was alone and helpless, Jamukha stood by him. They became Onda, blood brothers, the most sacred bond among the Mongols. Together, they hunted, fought, and dreamed of the future. The Merkit tribe. Remember this name because they were Temujin's greatest enemy. Remember, Temujin's father Yesuke had abducted his mother Hoyulin. Hoyulin had actually been promised to a man from the Merkit tribe. The Merkits had never forgotten that humiliation, that loss. They waited for revenge. And one night, they came for it. A large armed force of Merkits raided Temujin's camp. Temujin, his brothers, and his mother fled, hiding in the mountains and forests. But Borte could not escape. The Merkits seized Borte and abducted her, giving her to a Merkit warrior named Chilger as revenge. For Temujin, this was the most painful moment of his life. His wife, the woman he loved, was a prisoner of his enemies. But Temujin did not surrender. He ran to Togrul, knelt before him, and begged for help. Togrul kept his word. He sent his army of 10,000 warriors. Jamukha also came with 10,000 of his own. 30,000 Mongol warriors fell upon the Merkits. This was Temujin's first great battle. He fought with everything he had, every strike full of fury, every arrow ablaze with the fire of revenge. And they won. The Merkits were shattered. Their camp was burned. Borte was rescued. Alive, but broke. But Borte was pregnant, and no one knew whether the child was Temujin's or Chilger's. It was an agonizing uncertainty. Months later, a son was born. He was named Jochi, meaning guest. But Temujin, who could have rejected Jochi, did not. He accepted him as his own son. He loved him all his life. He honored him. This was the greatness of his character. After this victory, Temujin's fame spread everywhere. His followers grew from tens to hundreds to thousands. But this very success brought new trouble. His closest friend Jamukha began to grow jealous. He watched Temujin become popular, watched people flock to him. Perhaps one day, Temujin would become even more powerful than him. Friendship is a beautiful thing, but power and ambition often destroy friendship. So it was with Temujin and Jamukha. In 1188, one incident broke everything. One of Temujin's men stole a horse from Jamukha's clan. A minor offense, easily resolved. But Jamukha, in fury, seized the man and killed him in a way that makes your skin crawl. He had him boiled alive in a giant cauldron. This was the most savage punishment among the Mongols, reserved only for the gravest criminals. For stealing a horse, this was excessive. It was understood. He could no longer stay with Jamukha. Their paths were now separate. In the dead of night, he took his followers and left Jamukha's camp. And something remarkable happened. When Temujin left, many people left Jamukha and followed him. By 1189, Temujin had become so powerful and popular that his followers proclaimed him Khan, a ruler, a king. This was the highest honor for a leader. But for Jamukha, it was unbearable. His friend, his equal, now a Khan? This could not stand. Jamukha assembled a massive coalition, 30,000 warriors, 13 tribes united, all with one goal: destroy Temujin. In 1190, at a place called Dalan Baljut, the two old friends met in a great battle. Two enormous armies faced each other on Mongolia's vast grasslands. The earth shook with the thunder of hooves. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky. Swords clashed. Warriors screamed. And Temujin lost. His army was broken. Many loyal warriors died. Temujin himself was wounded. An arrow pierced his neck. Blood poured. But here we see the true strength of Temujin's leadership. A loyal companion named Jelme, who had been with him since childhood, sat by his side all night, sucking the poison from the wound with his own mouth. He saved Temujin's life. Jamukha won, but then he did something monstrous. Of Temujin's followers who had been captured, Jamukha had 70 of them boiled alive. Their heads were cut off and tied to horsetails for humiliation. This savagery horrified many, even his own allies. They realized Jamukha would do anything for power. He was unhinged. He was dangerous. Temujin, though defeated, did not give up. He fled. He hid. His wounds healed. Slowly he gathered a new army. And around him came extraordinary warriors. Barakhol, Jelme, Subutai, Jebe. Each of them would become one of history's greatest generals. Subutai would fight more than 60 battles and win nearly all of them. Jebe would conquer city after city. Temujin understood. Courage alone cannot win. You need strategy, organization, and discipline. He completely restructured his army, dividing it into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each unit had its own commander, clear chains of command, and most importantly, merit-based promotion. If you fought well and were loyal, you rose. Your birth or clan was irrelevant.
Temujin and Togrul struck the Tatars first. This time, fully prepared, strategy clear. The Tatars were crushed completely. Temujin took his revenge. However, Tatar women and children were not harmed. They were absorbed into Mongol society. Many Tatar women were taken as wives. Temujin himself married a Tatar princess named Yesugin, whom he loved.
Then came the Naimans. They were the masters of Western Mongolia. Vast armies, advanced weapons, even their own writing system. Their Khan, Taiyang Khan, was arrogant and powerful. He allied with Jamukha and many other tribes. Together they decided, Temujin must be finished. Now. In 1204, at a place called Chakirmat, the battle that would decide Mongolia's fate was fought. Temujin used a clever trick. At night, he ordered each of his soldiers to light 5 fires. From a distance, it looked like an enormous army of hundreds of thousands. The Naimans panicked. The next morning, battle began. Temujin's forces attacked like a storm. The Naimans collapsed. Taiyang Khan died on the battlefield. Temujin won. This was the most important victory of his life. Then Temujin faced Jamukha. 2 old friends, childhood companions, now 2 enemies. Jamukha said, "You have won. That is fate. Kill me. But please, one request. Do not spill my blood. Give me an honorable death." The Mongols believed that blood contained the soul. If blood was not spilled, the soul remained free, at peace in the next life. Temujin, with tears in his eyes, honored his old friend's final wish. Jamukha was executed by having his spine broken. No blood was shed. In 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, a great Kurultai, a Mongol assembly, was called. Leaders of all tribes came. Thousands of warriors, people from across all of Mongolia gathered. And there, before everyone, beneath a banner of 9 white horsetails, Temujin was proclaimed the sole ruler of all Mongols. He was given a new name, Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, or Khan as vast as the ocean, a ruler whose power knows no limit. But Genghis Khan's ambitions did not stop at Mongolia's borders. To the south lay China, the most prosperous and populous civilization on Earth. Genghis Khan first struck the Shisha kingdom, small but powerful. Then came the real challenge, the Jin dynasty. In 1211, Genghis Khan led his entire army into Jin territory. one of history's most devastating campaigns began. Mongol cavalry spread like a storm. Cities fell one after another. He used terror as a weapon. Destroy one city utterly, and 10 cities would surrender without a fight. In 1215, the Jin capital Zhongdu, present-day Beijing, surrendered after a 3-year siege. It was looted. Countless people. To the west, an event unfolded that would trigger even more bloodshed. In Central Asia lay the Khwarazmian Empire. Genghis Khan wanted trade, not war. In 1218, he sent 450 merchants. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, accused them of being spies, had them all killed, and looted their goods. Genghis Khan could not believe it. He sent 3 envoys to Sultan Muhammad, seeking justice. But the Sultan did something even more outrageous. He had one envoy killed and shaved the beards of the other 2 as an insult. Killing an envoy was a sacred crime. It was a declaration of war. After 3 days of prayer, Genghis Khan declared that Khwarazm would be wiped from the face of the earth. 200,000 warriors were mobilized, with his best generals, Subutai and Jebe, and his sons. Crossing mountains and deserts, they reached Central Asia. Bukhara, Samarkand, Herat, one by one the great cities fell, were looted and burned. In Bukhara, Genghis Khan entered the mosque and declared, "I am the punishment of God. Your rulers have committed great sins. Now they face their consequences." Sultan Muhammad fled. Subutai and Jebe chased him for thousands of miles until he died on a remote island. But Subutai and Jebe did not stop. They pressed further west through Georgia, Russia, Ukraine. Europe saw Mongol power for the first time. A warning, though they did not yet understand it. Genghis Khan was not only a warrior, he was a visionary ruler. He created the Yasa, a revolutionary legal code. Strict laws: steal and face death, lie and face death. Whether a prince or a commoner, the law was the same. But some laws were astonishingly progressive. Religious freedom for all, property rights for women, merit-based promotion, environmental protection. He built the Yam, a postal relay network. Messages traveled from China to Europe in just weeks. The Silk Road became safe. Trade, knowledge, and technology flowed freely. The Mongol Empire was the world's first true globalization. By 1225, Genghis Khan was past 60. A lifetime of war. One task remained: the Shisha dynasty, whose betrayal could never be forgiven. In 1226, he launched his final campaign. His body was failing, but he refused to turn back. Shisha had to be destroyed. He called his sons and gave his final orders. Ogedei would be the next Khan. Use the Shisha to help conquer the Jin Empire. Maintain unity. On August 18th, 1227, the most powerful man on earth drew his last breath. That orphan child, abandoned by everyone, died as an all-conquering ruler. He was buried in a secret location. All those who attended the burial were killed to preserve the secret. To this day, his tomb has never been found. And so, friends, that was the story of Genghis Khan, a man who completely transformed the world. His empire eventually fragmented, but his influence endures. Where you begin in life does not determine where you will end up. Genghis Khan proved that with iron willpower, intelligence, and the ability to organize, anything is possible. He was not perfect. He made many mistakes. He did many cruel things. But he left behind a legacy we can still see today. History is never black and white. So friends, what is your opinion of Genghis Khan? Was he a hero or a villain? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because history is not just for listening to, it is for understanding and debate.